record this stuff. So this week is population ecology, and we're going to talk about the general principles and dynamics of population ecology, population dynamics. We're going to do it in the context of forests. What are we trying to understand? Ultimately, we're going to try to understand what drives the population dynamics of individual species. When are populations increasing? When are they decreasing? Under what circumstances do we expect them to change in a positive or negative way? We're going to get insight into even some other kind of different things, and some things that are useful. You know, why do populations go extinct? When do they go extinct? Under what circumstances? And what controls maximum population sizes, rates of increase, so forth. These are really practical practical bits of information that come out of ecological principles. And like I say, I'm going to try to stick, even though these are general, they work for all kinds of different organisms. I'm going to try to tie them back to forests as much as possible. And the primary way that I do this is this paper that we read this week is fantastic. It's a really cool paper, and it is absolutely spot on for this topic. Now, what I want to point out to you about it is that there are no equations in this paper. This is all just like a very narrative-driven paper with a lot of data. But it's revisiting this really interesting case study in ecology that had outsized influence on people's thinking, especially up to about like 1980 or so. And they mentioned this in this book, that this was this event that happened on the Kaibab Plateau was in every ecology textbook or biology textbook for decades, and then it disappeared. So I know about this event because this is near the part of the country that I'm from. I'm from Payson, Arizona, which is not that far from here. Ecologically, it's very similar. Ponderosa pine, Aspen. The Kaibab Plateau is the north rim of the Grand Canyon, and that's a pretty remote place. Anybody been there? North rim? Yeah, cool, nice. Yeah, North Rim's, I mean, who's been to the South Rim? Yeah, so, okay. There were more nods for the South Rim there. The South Rim is, it's a lot easier to get there. So, you know, especially if you're coming from SoCal, you drive to Williams and then you can drive straight up to the canyon. Most people visit the South Rim. The North Rim is harder to get to, it takes longer, it's more remote, but it's great, it's quiet and stuff. So, this is part of the North Rim. It's high elevation, ponderosa pine. There's some mixed juniper areas, pinyon juniper and aspen. I think it's like 8,000 feet. Maybe it gets up to 9,000 feet. I can't remember. A couple years ago, some friends and I did the rim to rim to rim. You start at the South Rim, you go down, you come up to all the way up to the North Rim, and then you turn around and go back. It took us just like 18 hours, 43 miles and 1,200 vertical feet. I was tired. Actually, I was dragging for like the last 300 feet. I was like, it would be a better story if we were all together. But anyway, so yeah, this is the Kaibab Plateau. The thing that I want to kind of point out here is that it's an isolated place, but it's also the forest here is very isolated as well. You've got the Grand Canyon here bounding it on the southern side, so you have this just chasm basically, and then on the east, west, and even on the north, it's bounded by desert. This area is a high and dry desert, pretty typical Great Basin. There's at least the habitat transitions into something that is just not very productive, very dry annual grasses and shrubs. The reason I'm kind of pointing all this out is because this ended up being like a mountaintop kind of ecosystem, really kind of a plateau ecosystem that was mostly closed, mostly self-contained, that included a population of these kind of famous deer that were known for just being, I guess, pretty big and really beautiful animals. Teddy Roosevelt went up there and hunted them and thought that they were awesome. And there was also a healthy population of predators, mountain lion, wolves, and some other smaller predators. And at some point, because of concerns about how predators might affect the deer population, they were all removed. Oh yeah, this is just a kind of, you guys have all read this, but you know, this is just a picture of Aspen. And I don't have a picture from the Kaibab, but you know, that's Aspen there. And you know, in the setting that this is from the Sierra Nevada, but you know, in the setting that we find it in, it's mixed with conifers. In Arizona, you have it mixed with ponderosa pine and subalpine fir, some of the higher elevations. But anyway, it's out there. It's all mixed together here. Here's what happened. We have a removal of the predators, and we have this huge spike that this has never occurred again, fortunately. This huge spike in the deer population that ended up crashing in the decades afterwards, almost going down to zero, and then later leveling out here with some ups and downs. So what's going on here? We have this period of wildlife management where predators were extensively removed from this plateau. And keep in mind, like I say, it's an isolated place. It's possible for deer, for wolves, for the mountain lion to get there, but it's hard. It's hard. There isn't a lot of immigration. So if you remove all the mountain lion, all the predators, there will be no predators left in this area. So this management was very effective in removing the predators, so effective that the deer population skyrocketed and then absolutely crashed. And the reason it crashed was because the deer ate all of their forage. They basically ate up all the aspen, and that caused the whole thing to collapse. There was concern and even like supplemental feeding of these deer populations because it was really ugly, you know, starving animals is not pleasant to look at. Eventually, with Arizona Game and Fish managing the population, there has been some reestablishment of predators, and there's been controlled hunting in the area. So there's been some sort of predation on the deer populations to keep them in check. So what's happening here is every aspect of population dynamics that we want to understand, that are going to help us understand how forests change and even give us insight into useful management, is encapsulated in this one example. That's why I have this here. We've got all 4 topics that we're going to go over. Exponential growth, it's right here. We've got an exceeding of carrying capacity, that's happening here. And then we've got control of population dynamics here and here through predators. And then later on, we're going to see competitive interactions too. So that's why we read this. So anyway, let's look at some of this stuff. So what we found through this example is you can have nonlinear increases in deer populations on the Kaibab Plateau, at least, if you remove all the constraints on their growth. And exponential growth is one of the first population models that you encounter. It's just shows how nonlinear dynamics occur in population sizes over time. And the reason here is because you got some rate of growth, and then you just multiply that by the number of reproductive individuals at each unit of time. And so long as nothing is dying here, then you can have nonlinear increases in populations. This kind of dynamic happens in many ecological settings. It happens in disease outbreaks. It happens in insect population dynamics. It can even happen here with something like deer. You can add some realism to this. You can make the population growth rate, you know, a function of birth and death. But the problem with this model is that it always ends up in infinity, and it's just, infinity is not not where you want to be. It's hard to understand what's going on there. It's not very useful, and it's not real. So, but anyway, exponential growth is kind of dynamic. It happens. Here's my favorite example of it, besides the Kaibab Plateau, and this has nothing to do with forests. But the town of Taft, which is 50, or I guess I was going to say 45 minutes from here, but it's more like an hour from here. It's to the east. I believe it is actually in San Luis Obispo County, or it's almost. It's out in out by Maricopa. I don't know if you've ever been out there. It's on the 33. This is like a oil country. It's really dry, deserty environment. There was the Great Taft Mouse outbreak of 1926 occurred there. This was an event where mice overwhelmed the town, and there's a record of it at the West Current Oil Museum, and which is in Taft, and I am just keeping my fingers crossed that the shelter-in-place order is lifted so that I can go to the West Current Oil Museum. I so want to go to this place. I've read about this. I've learned about this, learning in the scientific literature, because it's so weird. You have this massive explosion of mice. That was a combination of the USGS killed a bunch of predators in the area, and then there was this odd rainstorm that flooded this part of the valley here, and all the mice ran away from the water, and they weren't being controlled by predators, and they overwhelmed the town. What ended up happening is, you know, Taft, which is not a very big town, is overrun by about 50 million mice. This account, the roads were covered in a mouse slush. Yuck. Mouse slushy? Gross. You know, that's because the cars, there's so many mice. And cats were rendered helpless. That was one of the anecdotes from this time. You know, the cats were just kind of like, there's too many mice. We've eaten our fill. You know, weird event, right? Of course, you have exponential growth of the population. It can happen. It doesn't go on forever, because, you know, eventually the population is limited. And that's the problem with exponential growth. It doesn't actually go to infinity in real systems. It gets capped somehow. But this dynamic, this part right here, is still useful for us, because number one, because it happens, but number two, because it tells us where the system is going. And so depending on how steep this is might indicate how much of a problem you're going to have, or how successful you are being in increasing your population dynamics. If you recall, before spring break, if you were following this, lots of what public health officials were trying to figure out was, how steep is this growth curve for COVID-19 in the United States? Because that is how we get insight into how bad we think this disease outbreak could be. How many intensive care beds are going to be filled? How many hospitalizations and how many lives are going to be lost through the outbreak? And of course, what was happening right in that time of March was that this curve was really steep. And so now here we are on Zoom. Hopefully things have been flattened enough that, you know, we're going to get back and be seeing each other in person. So anyway, but you know, it doesn't, like I say, these things are, they have use, they help you understand the real world, but you run into these limitations, which is they're not real. Real systems don't work like this. Real systems don't grow to infinity. They run out of resources. And so what happens when you exceed carrying capacity, when you run out of resources? And here I want to talk about this example. This is from St. Matthew's Island, where you have this reindeer population that greatly exceeds its carrying capacity and actually goes extinct because the population can't be maintained. And I'll post this. This is a nice graphic illustration of this story. Got the St. Matthew Island. I think it's in the Aleutian Archipelago, if I remember right, or it's in the Barents Sea. Some reindeer, it's way out in nowhere and there are no mammals on it. Some reindeer get introduced to supplemental, food for some sort of facility that's out there. And they grow to a very large size because there's this really nutritious lichen out on the island. However, the lichen grows more slowly than the reindeer populations, so they run out of food and then the whole population goes extinct. This is a pretty good graphic illustration, and it's too small to really see here, so I'll post the PDF. It's pretty good. It's worth, it tells the whole story and does it pretty well. So how do we make this more realistic? Well, most real systems, and whether all real systems, have some limit on their population sizes. Populations don't grow into infinity to cover the Earth and then the entire solar system and the galaxy and so on and so forth. They don't work that way. They run out of resources. So in order to understand systems in a more realistic way, we need to be able to depict that in some way. And the way that we can do that is by adding a parameter, this K, which is a carrying capacity. It basically levels off exponential growth at some maximum. And you may have heard this as a logistic growth. That's a good way to call it. This is a logistic function here. It's got a nonlinear exponential growth down in this part of the curve, and it's got exponential growth right here. But then as it gets up towards carrying capacity, this levels off and slows. Many real populations work like this. This is a good model. And when I say good models, all models are wrong. And that, what I mean by that is all models are some sort of simplification, representation of reality. But this one is a good one, but good models tell you something about how real systems work. So, and this is good in this way. It levels off, and real systems do that. So this kind of population growth is first credited to Malthus. I love this, his essay on this, principle of population and its effect on human happiness. And essentially what Malthus is saying is that when populations get so too big, and Malthus was, I think he was an ordained minister, and he was saying that he was basically predicting that there would be controls on population growth. And in particular, he was pointing out that as resources get scarce, then that would increase human suffering. And there's truth to that. The important thing is maintaining population sizes and resource levels maintaining population sizes, resource consumption, and resource levels at points where they maintain the health and well-being of human societies, and you can have happiness. And if you've heard of Malthusian population dynamics, this is this is the heir to that. Okay, so what happens when you exceed carrying capacity? Well, on St. Matthew's Island, you had extinction. It was kind of a special case. In simple models, you can have different kinds of population. You have different kinds of dynamics. You can exceed the carrying capacity, and then things will, then you'll have this kind of oscillation like the bouncing of a spring, or depending on how strong the interaction is, you can even have things that vary like this quite a lot. And that's what's happening there is population is being exceeded, the carrying capacity is being exceeded so much that there's a negative impact on the population, but it's so great that it goes back into positive growth territory, and you have that kind of oscillation over time. Both of these things have been observed. Both of them have been observed. And how individual organisms, whether they're trees or deer or whatever, interact with population dynamics, or will behave, how their populations will behave when they reach close to their population dynamics, is variable. That's something that this is important for the things that you're working on. You have to go and measure it. You have to go and figure it out. But both things happen. So yeah, and then there's St. Matthew's Island, the Splat. So okay, back to the Kaibab Plateau. We have this exponential growth period, but it doesn't go on forever. Clearly, these deer populations exceeded their carrying capacity, and then there was this negative feedback. Basically, they ran out of stuff to eat. They ran out of aspen to forage on, and that had a negative feedback on their population dynamics, and the population crashed. And like I say, this was pretty ugly, a lot of starving animals. So right at this point, we can see the effects of exponential growth, and we can see what happens when this population exceeds its carrying capacity. But how was it maintained prior to that time? And here's just some more stuff that comes from the paper that's kind of interesting. And this is aspen regeneration, or they had aged aspen trees in this stand. And I'll just walk you through this real quick. Because we're going to come back to this at various times while we talk about this. We have this period, in particular here, in the 1900s, where you have very low regeneration of aspen. And in the decades prior to that, and there's up and down, of course, the decades prior to that, you definitely have regeneration of aspen. And what's happened here is these trees got tall enough that they had canopy that wasn't going to be consumed by deer. These deer don't climb trees. They don't climb trees. They don't rip the bark off trees. They just nibble on the saplings. You may be aware that black bear kill lots of trees, and especially in some plantation settings with Douglas fir, they can be really damaging. They actually destroy trees and adult trees. That's not what deer do. They don't rip the bark off trees. They're just eating the saplings and seedlings. But we have this period where the deer population skyrockets, and we have low regeneration. And then there's another period in the 50s and 60s where you have low regeneration. However, later on, we have this big spike in aspen, and we'll come back to this. Why is there so much aspen regeneration here? Well, the deer population wasn't massive. The deer population was not so massive that it was exceeding that it was eating all the aspen. And in fact, this is in this period where we have predators reestablished on the plateau and regular hunts. And there's lots of aspen regeneration in this period, and I'll come back to why. But what I want to focus your attention on is this period in particular, and even here in the 50s and 60s. Lots of deer, lots and lots of deer, huge population sizes, unprecedented population sizes. And it affects the structure of these forests. It affects forest dynamics in a very, very clear way, by absolutely extensively limiting the regeneration of aspen. Now, this should be important to you if you care about aspen in any way. So aspen could be a competitor with ponderosa pine, which is the timber species in this system. So you would want to know what's happening with aspen, what's controlling it. Aspen is an important part of the deer forage in this system. So if you're trying to maintain a healthy deer population, you need some aspen. You need some aspen regeneration. And if there isn't any aspen regeneration, you're going to have starving deer. And that's could be really ugly. It was in this situation. And this is just a little bit of stuff. There was an actual enclosure. And during the period, what you can see here in the 50s and 60s is that you have regeneration in that enclosure. So this reduction in regeneration was not because of like the variation in climate or something. In places where browsing was excluded in the enclosures and around these stations where there were dogs kept and things, around in these corrals and in these areas with predators and dogs, the aspen still regenerated because the deer weren't going. So Here's a little bit more information, just because I never want to invoke magic here. The carrying capacity has tangible things that you can measure in order to get a good estimate of it. And they are, recall that, you know, population growth can be depicted as births and deaths. Well, we can start to add realism here, and in fact, we can parameterize what's in K. And in particular, we're going to integrate an effective crowding. This can get more detailed and yeah, just detailed. I think that's the way that I want to say it. In particular, we can talk about, we can start to model things like birth and death rates, or adjust them according to how much the effect of crowding has on each of those vital dynamics. So let's say C is crowding, N is the population size, and we can just add that to the death rate. This starts to add some realism here, and what happens is we can also, what you can do to make your models more realistic is add the effects, positive and negative effects of crowding. Now I need to talk about this this dynamic called an Allee effect, and this is generally thought of as a positive effect on birth rates from crowding. And it can also be something that helps maintain populations either by increasing birth rates or decreasing death rates. So Allee effects are common in animals. And it makes some sense if you have a larger group of organisms. They provide defense against predators. These are muskox here. The same thing happens with dolphins, and I think with maybe orca. When there's a larger group, there is more effective protection of the young and the more vulnerable parts of the population. That ends up actually increasing the carrying capacity. So if you can decrease death rates, increase birth rates, you can increase the carrying capacity. And we do that now with modern medicine. Allee effects are, and here, there's just a little bit more formal depiction of what happens when you integrate Allee effects. You can then create this or estimate this parameter K based on things that you can actually measure. So you can actually measure birth rates, regeneration of trees, their death rates, and then the effects of crowding or of, both positive and negative. So effects of crowding on death rate or the effects of crowding on birth rates. And these are nice because carrying capacity is a kind of parameter that you don't really know what it is until you get there. You know, you usually don't know how many trees you can have in a particular site until they start dying because they're being shaded out. I mean, maybe you'd have an idea beforehand because you would know that you could see that the crowns were all bunched together and so forth. But when you can measure these things, you get a better ability to predict them. Okay. Now, I always go through Allee effects because they're interesting things, but they're really problematic for trees. And the reason for that is because trees cannot move. For organisms that move, animals, positive Allee effects are great. You know, defense helps maintain your population, helps support the reproduction of your young, and that's great. But as a herd of muskox, when you start to run out of grass or lichen or whatever they eat, you can just move on to another part of the North Slope. They can just move, but trees can't move. So positive Allee effects can be really problematic, especially for species that create lots and lots of seeds like fir. So crowding can be helpful for trees in one sense. It can help them overcome pollen limitations. But when pollen is not limiting, as is the case in most of the time for trees, it is much better to distribute offspring broadly so that those offspring are not competing with the mother plants. So Allee effects are problematic for trees. If you have lots of survivorship of your offspring and they're close to you, then they're going to compete for you for light, water, and nutrients. That's a problem. We also see that we also see pathogens, tree pathogens, oftentimes get magnified underneath mother plants, and that's various reasons for that. But one is that if you have more individuals of one species in a single space, you're more likely to maintain pathogen populations. So again, Allee effects are working against trees in this case. Okay, so it's kind of a funny problem for trees. I mean, trees reproduce, make lots of offspring, lots and lots of young. You look at a stand with good regeneration, you're going to see lots and lots of seedlings. And these are cowrie seedlings, these little guys here. This is from up in Waipoa Forest, where I was last August. Seems so crazy to think that I was able to travel to New Zealand last August. I didn't think anything of it. You know, it was like, cool, I love going down there. I don't know when I'm going to go abroad again. Anyway, this is cowrie. I figured I'd be back there this summer working on this problem, but you know, it's going to have to wait. I'm going to just have to write papers on it as best I can from here. Anyway, here's cowrie. Typical of many plants, many trees, produces lots and lots of seeds, lots and lots of seedlings, but very few massive ancient trees like this. These trees are thousands of years old. They produce many, many, many offspring, but the key to fitness for these trees is those offspring need to be distributed widely in order to maintain the population. So if they all grew up underneath these trees, then they would be a problem in a competitive sense. This also kind of illustrates this characteristic of trees, which is they produce lots and lots of offspring with the expectation that most of those are going to die. So prolific reproduction, and then expectation that most are going to die, most are going to get killed by pathogens, or they're going to be outcompeted for light and so forth. But a few are going to survive into adulthood, and they're going to produce lots of offspring. It works for trees. Okay, and you may know this. This might be some review. I just want to put this into context. Trees are typically what we call type 3 survivorship, meaning that there's lots of offspring, but most of them don't survive. You go out and I can show you lots of different examples of stands that might have a carpet of tree seedlings. Very few of those survive. That's normal. Very few of them survive, but the ones that do tend to be long-lived and produce a lot of seeds. That's how trees work. You contrast that with humans, where you have high survivorship. We have few offspring, but we put lots of resources into them. It's just a different strategy. So there's high survivorship, low reproduction, and then things like birds, this type 2 survivorship is intermediate between the two. So that's probably a review, but again, that's our context that we're working in here. Now, again, this story about the Kaibab Plateau is really one about predators. What happens when you reduce predator dynamics and the effects of predators in a forest system? Predators, broadly speaking, in all different natural systems on Earth are in great jeopardy and have been dramatically reduced. So this is true in all kinds of settings. In marine settings, with sea stars, there's a number of diseases and other problems that have affected sea stars. Wolves were hunted into extirpation in the US. They're starting to come back. And apparently, I think it was 2 years ago, we had a pack actually crossed in from Oregon and ran around up in the Modoc for a few days and then went back up into Oregon. So we've had wolves in California, at least up on the Modoc, for a couple of days. Keep your fingers crossed. Maybe they'll come back. I'm supposed to go to the Modoc this summer, and I gotta say, I've never seen a wolf, but I would be psyched. And then our big cats are also being are being impacted as well. And so what does this mean? Well, here's another example. Wolves were extirpated from Yellowstone. They were hunted into local extinction, but they were reintroduced. I believe this is in the 90s. They were reintroduced, and this is just from the Wikipedia page on this, but I think it's a really remarkable photograph. This is a truck carrying wolves coming into Yellowstone, and these are well-wishers who are lining the gates of the park to welcome the wolves back. That was pretty cool. This was a very bold program, but one that has been a success. The wolves are now back in Yellowstone. They're self-sufficient. There were all kinds of concerns about how this would work, raising wolves in captivity. Would they be so accustomed to people that they would hang out around people or something like that? But basically, they took them out, they set the cages on the ground, they opened the cages, and the wolves just ran off. They just ran off and started eating elk. So we got lucky in this case. And then there's been, this is a great photograph, of course, from a helicopter showing the wolves. They're running down this elk here. Yellowstone successfully extirpated its wolves, but then it started to have all kinds of other problems with regeneration of trees and overpopulation of elk. And it wasn't as severe as what happened on the Kaibab Plateau. It was kind of the same thing. In particular, this is some data from the papers that have come out on trying to understand the effects of wolves on woody plant productivity here. What happened was with the loss of wolves, we had lots and lots of elk. Once the wolves were introduced, we had reductions in elk populations that came down to levels that seemed to, I would say, are probably healthier. Interestingly, wolves also seem to have indirect positive correlation anyway with the populations of bison and pronghorn. So Yellowstone seems to have become a healthier ecosystem by having wolves in it. And part of that is because the wolves, they do two things. One, they attack elk and kill them sometimes, but they also just scare them off. So that creates space for other animals, and it also leads to an increased production of, particularly of woody plant biomass. And let me show you this. This kind of really remarkable thing that happened in Yellowstone is that with these elk populations were decimating streamside willow stands, and willows are pretty are good forage, and they're woody plants, but by decimating the willows, that led to a channelization of streams, and having wolves around has reduced the elk populations. It's kept the elk out of the willows. Basically, elk don't like to go into willow stands when the wolves are around because they can hide in there and ambush them. What this has meant is that the predators are having this indirect but positive effect on the plant populations. This is called a trophic cascade. It's a interaction across different trophic levels, and one where the predators are increasing the health of the forest here. If you would allow me to call a willow stand a forest, it's a woody plant community. Anyway, this has been seems to be wildly successful. There's still tension. Wolves will kill cattle. They do. That's part of the cost of this. They're wild animals. They're not only going to attack elk. They're also going to attack livestock. So there is still some tension. But by and large, or at least in terms of Yellowstone, it's certainly increased the health of these ecosystems. And it seems to be working. It's a positive story. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. I have this system of I have a system of equations here for formally talking about predator-prey dynamics, and I'm going to go through those next time with the corresponding equations for competitive dynamics. The next lecture, and I will pull this back to the Kaibab Plateau. Why going through these sets of equations and understanding the basics of how these systems of equations work help you understand how what they mean for forest dynamics. But I'm gonna try not to overdo it today. And like I say, they're just one of those things. Like I try to keep these videos short, 3 to 5 minutes. But you know, they're just one of those things when it's kind of tricky or kind of confusing or non-intuitive. Sometimes it's just better to have a video that you can go back to and say, how does that one work again? You know, that sort of thing. Students always, like, there's always some bumps in this part of the class. This is, there's a couple, you know, it's got some math, and there are a few things that can be kind of confusing. So, like I said, the videos are me in front of a chalkboard, but I reviewed them. They're okay. I mean, at least I don't think that I bumble too much. Cool. All right. Well, I'm going to turn off the